The rise in anti-Semitism. There is a parallel between what is happening now in 2023 and what happened in the 1920s a century ago, both here in the United States and abroad, and most importantly, in Germany. These kinds of events helped lead to the rise of the Nazis, and in turn would also eventually lead to what would become the mass murder of millions of Jews. That, my friends, is going to be the topic of today's episode. And so, from the topical umbrella, I am Adrian. This is my show, the place where we cover everything. So what is anti-Semitism? Well, anti-Semitism refers to a deep-seated prejudice or hostility towards Jews, often rooted in religious, racial, or ethnic bias. This form of discrimination has manifested in various ways throughout history, ranging from social exclusion and verbal slurs to violent attacks and genocide, most notably during the Holocaust during World War II. Despite the lessons of history, anti-Semitism has persisted in many parts of the world, manifesting in forms like hate speech, vandalism, and other forms of hate crimes, which represents a continuing challenge for societies to address. The sudden, public, visible rise of anti-Semitism here in the United States is mirrored across much of Europe. Evil, my friends, is once again being tolerated by weak and inept leaders around the world. What we are facing now will almost assuredly lead to mass deaths everywhere if this intolerance, this hateful group of people are not quelled, and soon. Evil never rests, and given freedom to continue to terrorize, physically assault, and murder, this will only escalate. All we need to do is look at history, which can be our guide for precisely how much horror is in store for the world if this is not stopped. And in fact, in a weird quirk of fate, this rise in hate around the world today mirrors a century ago, in the 1920s. To demonstrate this, let's go back in time. And we're going to start here in the United States. You see, by the time the 1920s had arrived, anti-Semitism was permeating practically every aspect of American society, with newspapers and magazines commonly printing anti-Semitic articles and cartoons. Among those who participated in this racist trend, and who today is considered one of the key figures in promoting anti-Semitism during this period, was none other than Henry Ford, the automaker, who owned a newspaper, the Dearborn Independent, which published hateful anti-Semitic propaganda through a series of articles published in his newspaper. These articles were published between 1920 and 1922, and they were later compiled into a 4-volume set of booklets titled The International Jew. The articles published in the newspaper attributed all evil to Jews or Jewish capitalists, blaming them for causing wars, outbreaks of thieving and robbery, and inefficiency in the Navy. Now, worth noting here, Adolf Hitler himself, the leader of the Nazi Party, admired Henry Ford, and he kept copies of The International Jew in his office. Now, while Henry Ford did not personally write the articles, it was claimed that he expressed his opinions verbally to William J. Cameron, as well as Ernest G. Leopold. Now, Cameron had the main responsibility for expanding these opinions into article form, and Leopold was responsible for collecting more material to support the articles. Now, eventually Ford would issue a public apology, claiming that he was unaware of the nature of the remarks published in his newspaper, and he ended the publication of the Dearborn Independent in December of 1927. Now, this wasn't the only instance of anti-Semitism. You see, in the 1920s, there was also a resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan, or the KKK, which was purported to have reached 4 million members by the mid-1920s. This rise in the KKK would follow the incident of the lynching of Leo Frank, a Jewish-American businessman in Atlanta, Georgia. This would mark a significant event in American history, marked by anti-Semitism, a media frenzy, and a controversial trial. You see, back on April 27th of 1913, a 13-year-old factory worker, Mary Fagan, was found dead in the basement of the National Pencil Company factory. Leo Frank was then arrested and charged with her murder 2 days later. The trial began on July 28th of 1913, and after just 3 weeks, Frank was convicted and sentenced to death by hanging. Now, the prosecution, it has been said, exploited misconceptions about circumcision and unfavorable testimony about Frank's character from a few of his young female employees to paint him as a pervert. However, after reviewing over 10,000 pages of court documents and touring the pencil factory where the murder had taken place, then Georgia Governor John Slayton concluded that Frank was innocent and commuted his death sentence to a life imprisonment instead. Now, this decision sparked outrage among certain citizens in Atlanta, and on August 16th of 1915, a group of men calling themselves the Knights of Mary Fagan kidnapped Frank from the state prison and lynched him near Marietta, Georgia, the next day. This group included individuals with various skills, such as an electrician, car mechanics, a locksmith, and a telephone man, a medic, a hangman, and a lay preacher. The ringleaders, who were well known locally, were not publicly named until June of 2000. This list included Joseph Mackey Brown, who was former governor of Georgia, Eugene Herbert Clay, a former mayor of Marietta, and later president of the Georgia Senate. Then there was E.P. Dobbs, who was mayor of Marietta at the time, Moultrie McKinney, Sessions lawyer and banker, and several current and former Cobb County sheriffs and other individuals of various professions. The lynching of Leo Frank was widely covered by the press and sparked nationwide outrage. The case is considered a miscarriage of justice, obviously, and is seen as a symbol of the anti-Semitism and racism prevalent in the South at the time. The case also led to the growth of the Anti-Defamation League, or the ADL, and would eventually lead to the reformation of the Ku Klux Klan itself. Today, modern researchers generally agree that Frank was wrongly convicted, and Jim Conley, another employee at the factory who testified against Frank, was in fact likely the actual murderer. Now, there were many more examples like this during this time in the United States history. The rise of anti-Semitism in the U.S. during the 1920s had profound impacts on the Jewish community and American society as a whole. It led to widespread fear, discrimination, physical assaults, and psychological damage, and it contributed to an increase in xenophobia, racism, and extremism in the broader society. And they weren't alone. Besides the United States, Europe had their own anti-Semitism problem, but for this episode we're going to focus in on Germany itself. The rise of anti-Semitism in Germany during the 1920s would eventually lead to the actions taken by the Nazis, which led to the murder and eventual genocide of millions of Jews. Now, hostility towards Jews did not originate with Hitler or the Nazis. In fact, it was already prevalent in Germany during the 1920s. Instead, the Nazi Party, which emerged in Germany following World War I, capitalized on this existing anti-Semitism coupled with the economic and political instability of the time. They blamed the Jews for Germany's problems, including the country's defeat in World War I, as well as the economic crisis of the Great Depression. Adolf Hitler, the leader of the Nazi Party, articulated his anti-Semitic ideology in his book Mein Kampf. In it, he expressed his belief that the Jews were the source of all of Germany's troubles. The Nazis used the Jews as a scapegoat for practically everything, and they used their propaganda to foster a climate of indifference to the fate of the Jews and incited hatred against them. Nazi propaganda often depicted Jews as subhuman and dangerous enemies, and was used to justify violence against them. This sounds familiar with what's happening now in 2023, doesn't it? So where did all of this anti-Semitism lead to? And why is it so important that we learn lessons from history? Well, you see, once the Nazis came to power in 1933, they began implementing a series of laws and decrees aimed at segregating Jews from German society, removing them from the economy and forcing them to leave the country. This included boycotts of Jewish businesses, staged book burnings, and the enactment of anti-Jewish legislation. For example, the Nuremberg Laws of 1935 further marginalized Jews by banning them from marrying non-Jews and removing their citizenship, including their right to vote. The persecution of Jews escalated into the late 1930s, and on November 9th, 1938, known as Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass, the Nazis initiated widespread pogroms, or organized attacks, against Jews across Nazi territories. This night of violence, vandalism, and persecution is often described as the beginning of the Holocaust. And what was the Holocaust exactly? Well, it was the horrifying, systematic mass murder of Jews, which began in 1941, more than 8 years after the Nazis assumed power. The Nazis, you see, began rounding up and shooting supposed security threats, initially targeting mostly Jewish men of military age. However, it didn't take long, weeks in fact, for the killing to turn genocidal. This includes the murder of Jewish women and children and the destruction of entire Jewish communities. This is why it is so important to understand history. The rise of antisemitism in Germany during the 1920s provided the fertile ground necessary for the Nazi Party's rise to power, which would ultimately lead to the genocide of millions of Jews. So let's go back to the present day, 2023, and why learning this lesson of history is so important. The conflict between Israel and Hamas has exposed a massive growing wave of antisemitism around the globe. Academic studies have shown that anti-Semitism often spikes amid crisis points in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The Anti-Defamation League has cataloged a 400% increase in anti-Semitic incidents in the US since the start of this recent conflict. It also manifests in the form of anti-Semitic rhetoric, which can have a significant impact on Jewish communities. This rhetoric can foster a climate of fear and hostility, leading to the marginalization of Jews and making them feel unsafe. It can also lead to the suppression of Jewish identity, as individuals may fear becoming targets of anti-Semitic comments or action. The danger of unchecked anti-Semitism is that it can lead to widespread violence and persecution, as was the case in Nazi Germany. Now, while it is legitimate to criticize any government's actions, it becomes anti-Semitic when it involves dehumanizing or demonizing Jews, or holding all Jews collectively responsible for the actions of the Israeli government, which we are seeing all over Europe and even here in the United States. Now, if you find yourself sympathizing with this kind of hate in your heart, it is time to take a hard look in the mirror and ask yourself if you really want to participate in this kind of evil. Is this the person you want to be? This coddling of hatred will only lead to tragic death and suffering in the future. And if you think it ends with just Jewish people suffering, you have got another thing coming. Evil like this only ends when it is either stopped or it has consumed everything in its wake. Standing by, doing nothing, or worse, cheering this evil behavior on will only end in tragedy for us all. And that, my friends, is going to bring this episode to a close once more. Now, before I close out the episode, a favor to ask. If you like this content, obviously liking and subscribing to this channel is greatly appreciated, but it would also help tremendously if you do me the honor of sharing this video with friends and family. It helps expand the reach and helps this channel grow faster. This is only the beginning here for the topical umbrella, and I will be hard at work to expand content going forward. In any case, regardless of whether you choose to subscribe or share, thank you so much for joining me on this program today. From the Topical Umbrella, my friends, I am Adrian, and I will see you all next time.